President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830 required all Native American tribes to move west of the Mississippi. With the mass of white settlers arriving by the thousands, many Indians had already been driven out. But others, particularly the 5 civilized tribes, had adopted many tenets of the invading culture in an attempt to live peaceably on their ancestral lands alongside the white man. The Cherokees fought a legal battle in the Supreme Court in Worcester versus Georgia and won, only to have President Jackson ignore Justice Marshall's ruling by sending federal troops to enforce removal. The Cherokees, under the leadership of Chief John Ross, wanted to continue the legal battle. But the Treaty Party, led by Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, saw it as a fight they could not win, and covertly signed the Treaty of New Echota, ceding all Cherokee lands in the east to the federal government in exchange for land in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. The tragic move west forever became known as the Trail of Tears.
If it was their death warrant, Boudinot and the Ridges still had hopes of survival out west. And for Ross and his anti-removal party, what the Treaty Party had done amounted to nothing less than a betrayal of the Cherokee people.
I believe the Treaty of New Echota, signed by unauthorized individuals in Washington, will never be regarded by the Cherokee Nation as a treaty. It is a fraud upon the Cherokee people.
Look at the mess. Look at the entire population as it now is, and say, can you see any indication of a progressing improvement? Anything that can encourage a philanthropist? You know that it is almost a dreary waste. Look, my dear sir, around you, and see the progress that vice and immorality have already made. You will find an argument in every tippling shop in the country. You will find its cruel effects in the bloody tragedies that are frequently occurring in the frequent convictions and executions for murders, and in the tears and groans of the widows and fatherless, rendered homeless, naked, and hungry by this vile curse of our race.
You suppose we are to be removed by circumstances rendered disagreeable and even untenable, to be secured in a better home where nothing can disturb or dispossess us. Here is the great mystification. We are not secured in the new home promised to us. We are exposed to precisely the same miseries.
If the dark picture which I have here drawn is a true one, can we see a brighter prospect ahead? In another country, and under other circumstances, there is a better prospect. Removal, then, is the only remedy, the only practicable remedy.
The Cherokee people will always hold themselves ready to respect a real treaty and bound to sustain any treaty which they can feel that they are bound to respect. But they are certain not to consider the attempt of a very few persons to sell the country for themselves, our sacred inheritance from our fathers.
Fly for your lives, I would say to my countrymen. You, among the rest, fly from the moral pestilence that will finally destroy our nation. Are we to run the race of all our brethren who have gone before us, waking as a ghost over the ashes of his fathers, to remind a stranger that such a race once existed? May God preserve us from such a destiny.
I have no motive, my friends, to deceive you. I am sincerely desirous to promote your welfare. Listen to me, therefore, while I tell you that you cannot remain where you now are. Circumstances that cannot be controlled and which are beyond the reach of human laws render it impossible that you can flourish in the midst of a civilized community. You have but one remedy within your reach, and that is to remove to the west. The choice now is before you. May the Great Spirit teach you how to choose. Your friend, Andrew Jackson.
By the end of 1837, there were more whites than Cherokees living inside the nation. Thanks to Georgia's land lottery, most of the Cherokee land in Georgia had been given away to or forcibly taken by white settlers. Federal agents kept encouraging Cherokees to remove, but with the approach of the deadline in the spring of 1838, only about 2,000 had gone ahead and voluntarily left for the West. The fact was, Cherokees continued to believe, to hope, that somehow Chief John Ross's resistance would prevail. In the spring of 1838, Chief Ross instructed his overseers to plant crops, clearly signaling to his nation that he and they were going nowhere. The U.S. government, which had already begun forcible removal of the Creeks and Seminoles, was preparing for resistance, even armed struggle by the Cherokees. The Choctaws had removed first out west, then Chickasaws, both victims of robbery and disease. Portions of the Creeks who had resisted were subdued by force, and some 1,600 Creek men were dispatched out west. Another 776 Creeks were coaxed into helping federal troops root out Seminole warriors in the Florida swamps. Captured Seminoles were sent out by boats to the Arkansas Territory.
Gal no uno tlun de gese I justani da sting na Washington. Kadorskin aneliskan. Kadorskin nam da nuskan na jik anija legging.
Jackson's supporters assumed that the full-bloods were hunters and were willing to trade their lands in the east for better hunting in the west, and that the mixed bloods were plantation owners who didn't want to give up their wealth.
Most of the treaty supporters were acculturated to some degree, whereas John Ross and his non-removal party were mostly traditional Cherokees. Those that would support removal, though, were the acculturated Cherokees because they saw they could go out west and start anew with their farms, etc. Traditional Cherokees wanted to remain in their homeland where their ancestors had lived and where their parents and grandparents had been buried.
Chief Ross was an interesting man in that everything about his family, and in fact the way he made his living, should have put him as a sympathizer for removal. He was 1/8 Cherokee by blood. He was a wealthy planter. He owned slaves. But he, down to his very core, believed that the traditionalists, the majority of the tribe, was the real Cherokee vision.
The accusations of being a half-breed and therefore not looking after the tribe's true interests were slung back and forth. In fact, most of the leaders of most of the tribes were at least quasi-assimilated. Many of them were so-called half-breeds. They had white relatives, some white ancestry. And so the charge of being a half-breed and therefore not a true Indian or not representing the Indian's true interest is an accusation that everybody used.
In early 1836, the War Department sent General John E. Wool and 2,000 federal troops into Cherokee country. Wool's job? Disarm Cherokees and enroll as many as he could as voluntary immigrants.
General Wool, who was the officer who was in charge of the early stages of this removal controversy, was sort of the old school, military old school, no-nonsense individual. And he was prepared to carry out whatever orders he might have, but at the same time he was very forthright in condemning much of the local white population in Georgia and some of the other southeastern states who he believed were instrumental in dispossessing the Indians.
Cherokees, I've not come among you to oppress you, but to protect you and see that justice is done you as guaranteed by the treaty. Be advised and turn a deaf ear to those that would induce you to believe that no treaty has been made with you and that you will not be obliged to leave your country. They cannot be friends, but the worst of enemies. And why not abandon a country no longer yours? Do you not see the white people daily coming into it, driving you from your homes and possessing your houses, your cornfields, and your ferries?
Thus began the rounding up of Cherokees. The U.S. ordered troops to seize the remaining Cherokees and imprison them in stockades in preparation for their forced removal. Amidst the humiliation and brutality, General Wool tried to avoid the worst excesses.
Colonel Byrd, you will treat the Cherokees kindly and give them all the protection guaranteed by the Lake Treaty. You will inform them that rations, blankets, shoes, and other articles will be furnished the poor of the nation on application. Lieutenant Dees, you're authorized to purchase clothing for covering the nakedness of the Indians if needed. Major Delaney, proceed to Red Clay to collect creeks in the neighborhood. When you have a sufficient number, conduct them to Ross's Landing. On no account must the soldiers be permitted to offer any insult to them or allow to commit any depredation on their property. Secretary Poinsett, 300 creeks apprehended. These, with the 150 at Gunter's Landing, will be sent to Arkansas. Those found in Cherokee country generally in wretched condition.
In Georgia, the roundup was especially brutal. The Baptist missionary, Evan Jones, witnessed much of it.
The Cherokees are nearly all prisoners. They've been dragged from their houses and encamped at the forts and military posts all over the nation. In Georgia, especially, multitudes were allowed no time at all to take anything with them except the clothes they had on. Their well-furnished houses were left a prey to plunderers who, like hungry wolves, followed in the train of the captors. These wretches would rifle the houses and strip the helpless, unoffending owners of all they have on earth. The poor captive, in a state of distressing agitation, his weeping wife almost frantic with terror, surrounded by a group of crying, terrified children, without a friend to speak a consoling word. Aye, they are prisoners, without a crime to justify the fact. I have heard of only one officer in Georgia who manifests anything like humanity in his treatment of this persecuted people.
Meanwhile, Ross was making the rounds, telling his people to be firm, to trust him. It would all work out. But by now, the U.S. government was ignoring Ross, and removal was evolving from a fearful prospect into an agonizing reality.
I do not believe anything short of military intervention would have made the Cherokee leave. If Chief Ross had said, "No, there's no hope left, we have to leave," they would have found a different leader who would continue that fight. That's how deeply committed the Cherokee people were to their homeland.
For Elias Boudinot, Major Ridge and John Ridge, and the Reverend Samuel Worcester, it was time to vote with their feet. Like many of their friends who early on recognized the inevitable, in 1837, they left by water for their new home in the West.
Squads of troops were sent to search out with rifle and bayonet every small cabin hidden away in the coves or by the sides of mountain streams, to seize and bring in as prisoners all the occupants, however or wherever they might be found. Systematic hunts were made for Indian graves to rob them of the silver pendants and other valuables deposited with the dead.
When the troops arrived, most Cherokees simply waited quietly and allowed the trespassing soldiers to arrest them and march them off to stockades. Few had time to pack their goods or sell their livestock.
Da hiu nu nante, du yukte nige son nigalstani da hai. Asen, du nante gen, lelege unelise, lelege unantestani yonegi unetlunda neli dolai.
Another story that was told of a young girl who was hiding from the soldiers with an infant. And she falls in the river as she's running and hiding from the soldiers. And she's holding her baby to her chest, to her bosom. She hides in the water. And it was during the winter months of 1838 and 1839 that the removal began, so it was pretty cold, and it does get cold in these mountains. But she's hiding in the water, holding her baby to her bosom. As cold as it was, she stayed in the water until the soldiers passed on by and she could get out and escape from the soldiers.
By mid-June, soldiers had imprisoned most of the Cherokees. Taken to stockades and camps, they awaited their forced departure to the west. To many observers, the harsh conditions and loss of life resulting from the removal of Creeks and other eastern Indians could be blamed on the private contractors hired by the War Department to feed the immigrants on the trail. The contractors got a fixed sum per person per month, and so they did all they could to increase their own profit by reducing both the amount and quality of the provision they supplied.
Call that That was better 3 days ago when it was here.
Yet all this removal of the Indians is being represented by editors of newspapers as being conducted with the utmost kindness and without suffering. And I am sorry to say that the Boston Recorder gives a perfectly incorrect view of this subject by publishing only such extract from Southern papers as keep the sufferings of the Indians entirely out of view.
The conditions that removal produced for the Cherokees were truly horrendous. First of all, Cherokees were rounded up in late spring of 1838 and imprisoned in stockades. Many families had no time to prepare. They ended up in the stockade with little in the way of bedding, little food, no way to prepare food.
The stories were very revealing. They told how that the soldiers came to Cherokee County and up on Owl Creek and Hanging Dog, and they brought the people out of their homes, and this would include my great-great-grandfather, Genick Owl. They dragged them out of their homes and marched them down to Fort Butler. And while staying in Fort Butler, they told us that the mud was at least 6 to 8 inches deep.
Conditions in the stockade, sanitary conditions, were deplorable. People very quickly began to sicken and die. We will probably never know how many Cherokees succumbed before they ever left their homelands, before they ever embarked on the Trail of Tears. It was truly a summer of of enormous tragedy, tragedy on a scale that I think Americans can hardly imagine.
There is a repugnance of many of the Indians, especially the mountain Cherokees, to the use of medicine, no matter how pressing the necessity. We should feel little astonishment at finding a high grade of diarrhea, hazardous dysentery, and urgent remittent fever prevalent to a great and deplorably fatal extent. In addition to this, measles and whooping cough appeared epidemically among the Cherokees about the 1st of June. All these diseases are now rife among them.
To help expedite the removal process, President Martin Van Buren, Jackson's successor, ordered Major General Winfield Scott to enforce removal. And so in May of 1838, General Scott, a veteran of the Black Hawk War in 1832, arrived in Cherokee country to carry out the military forced migration. He assembled an army of 7,000 men over 4 states to conduct the roundup and removal of the southeastern Indians.
Cherokees, the President of the United States has sent me here with a powerful army to cause you, in obedience with the New Echota Treaty of 1835, to join that part of your people already established in prosperity on the far side of the Mississippi. All those troops, regular and militia, are your friends. Receive them and confide in them as such. Obey them when they tell you that you can no longer remain in this country. Soldiers are as kind-hearted as they are brave, and the desire of every one of us is to execute our painful duty in mercy. We are commanded by the President to act towards you in that spirit, and such is also the wish of the whole people of America.
Between May 24th and July 1st, General Scott's troops rounded up 16,000 Cherokees. An especially powerful observer of the removal process was the Reverend Daniel Buttrick, one of the missionaries arrested for standing up for the Cherokees. Buttrick's journal of his trail experiences offers a telling commentary.
Oh, what a sweeping wind has gone over and carried its thousands into the grave, while thousands of others have been tortured and scarcely survived, and the whole nation comparatively thrown out of house and home during this most dreary winter. And why? As coming from God, we know it is just, but what have they done to the United States? Have they violated any treaty or any intercourse law or abused any of the agents or officers of the United States? Or have they refused to accommodate United States citizens when passing through the country? No. No such thing is pretended. For what crime, then, was this whole nation doomed to this perpetual death, this almost unheard of suffering, simply because they would not agree to principles which would be at once death to their national existence, and that a few unauthorized individuals might at and times set aside the authority of the National Council and principal chief, and in opposition to the declared will of the nation, dispose of the whole public domain as well as the private property of individuals, and render the whole nation houseless and homeless at pleasure.
Meanwhile, the suffering in the camps that summer grew unbearable. Scott himself showed up in camp on the Hiwassee River on the first day of roundup. There were thousands there. By all accounts, it was a moving sight, even for Scott. The heat was terrible. There were an average 3 or 4 deaths a day. Even still, Scott urged all able-bodied men to do a daily march of 12 to 15 miles to prepare themselves for what lay ahead.
Did not move this day, the party requiring rest and being more than one half sick. Notwithstanding every effort used, it was impossible to prevent their eating quantities of green peaches and corn. Consequently, the flux raged among them and carried off some days as high as 6 and 7.
Kogen no dis lekke gese jana is. You dis lekke ujik. Du wayan. taka hjoske, tlawote vi justen dulstana gese. Asken ik ju est, tlagohus jun tohti gese, jiu. Toen ik zochte gehen du weeën. Na hi junsku, toen dlange, ud lena he. I just du gehen, ud lena, toen dlange. Skujans ku doen je husen na hi. Hier de gogeste deel. Zie daar je juist in Galstana schone lezen. Dan unie nog zele. General Scott ju doet. Tlada kuhus ju juist in de dan tla ase igi sul go is de gesest. Goge deel zie dan nige aan. Unog zele.
In June, General Winfield Scott ordered forced removal suspended until September due to the heat and sickness of the season. He had hoped for a fast and efficient military operation, but bad weather dashed all his hopes. Scott assured Chief Ross that he wanted to prevent bloodshed and unnecessary suffering, but Ross had other plans.
The Cherokees asked Scott if they could delay removal until autumn, and they would remove themselves. Scott agreed on the condition that they would leave by September 1st. However, the drought was unprecedented during that summer, and they did not really start until October.
In September 1838, John Ross and 6 others began overseeing arrangements for self-removal. Ross negotiated a contract that called for a cost of $65.88 per person for the entire journey, which meant 16 cents a day per person for rations and 40 cents a day per horse or ox. Ross included costs for wagons, horses, drivers, doctors, interpreters, conductors, and other support personnel. He also argued for soap, coffee, and sugar as essentials, but the government said no, they were not necessities. The Treaty Party was furious when it learned that the government had made arrangements with Ross.
The Treaty Party opposed Ross's taking control over removal. Most of the Treaty Party members had actually moved before that first detachment on June 6th. There was still a separate detachment of pro-removal Cherokees who refused to move under Ross's auspices.
To carry out self-removal, John Ross put his brother Lewis Ross, a well-to-do merchant, in charge of provisioning Cherokees and named various conductors to organize the move. Ross and Company would plan the routes, provide transportation, tolls for roads and ferries, blankets and clothing, get food and forage along the way.
Chief Ross, when he took over the removal of the Cherokee, worked tirelessly with his brother Lewis to provide for each detachment. The figures and the planning, if you can, imagine what it is like to try to send 13 detachments of between 1,000 to 1,200 people across this country and provide for them along the way. It was a monumental undertaking.
At first, General Scott balked at this plan, telling Ross he had an offer from a white contractor who had been moving creeks to the west for half the price Ross estimated. Ross's price assumed migrants could cover 10 miles a day, and with a journey of roughly 800 miles, removal could be accomplished over land in 80 days. But water was safer and better, Scott argued. And it was true. In good weather, the trip by boat had been done in around 3 weeks. The federal government constructed a whole fleet of keelboats on the Tennessee River that was simply waiting to be used. The fleet could carry more than 1,000 people, and by returning for other people, the entire tribe, it was thought, could be moved over the winter. But on the first voyage with the keelboats, only 300 Indians showed up. Some 50 others deserted in fear, after feeling the shifting of the keelboat's deck under their feet and hearing stories of shipwreck and cholera on the river.
The entire removal was supposed to happen by water. The situation in Georgia and then at the camps at Ross's Landing was so chaotic that everyone was horrified by the situation. Simultaneously, the river levels were falling to such a point that water traffic became impossible.
And so the possibility of transporting people by water evaporated with the drought of the summer of 1838 in the Tennessee Valley.
Traveling west by rivers also carried powerful meanings for Cherokees that white officials couldn't imagine. Cherokees believed that rivers had mystic powers that commanded their respect and fear. Rivers, they believed, were waterways into the underworld.
Traveling west by water held some powerful connotations for the Cherokees that white officials didn't understand. Water was regarded as the long person, with his head in the mountains and his feet in the sea. Water was a powerful force for spiritual and physical cleansing. There were also Cherokee stories about water, the waterfalls or the whirlpools, being the gateways to another world. And west for the Cherokees was the direction of the darkening land. That's where spirits went when they died. West was the direction of death.
In the end, Cherokees traveled both by river and land, following several different routes. Ross organized the tribe into 13 detachments of approximately 1,000 people each. About 1/10 of the immigrants were black, slave, and free. Each detachment had a conductor and assistant to supervise. Journeying with each detachment was a physician, an interpreter, a wagon master, and a commissary agent.
The present condition of the Cherokee people is such that all dispute as to the time of immigration is set at rest, being already severed from their homes and their property, and however strong their attachment to the homes of their fathers may be, their interest and their wishes now are to depart as early as may be consistent with their safety.
Little did they know, but they would be 3.5 months on the road through the bitterest part of the winter. The first group to depart under John Ross's management left the camps on August 28, 1838, consisting of 710 people and 36 wagons and teams. During the entire trip, it had 9 births, 54 deaths, and 24 runaways. According to First Lieutenant H.L. Scott of the 4th Infantry, who followed the first immigrating parties for 80 miles, everything went smoothly.
The march of this party through the country was perfectly orderly. The greatest harmony and cheerfulness prevails in these 2 detachments, and with the exception of 4 deaths among the children, they have met with no mishaps and encountered no difficulties thus far on the route.
William Shoyakudi, the nephew of John Ross, who witnessed the departure of Ross's detachment, remembered it differently.
The trains were stretched out in a long line along the road through a heavy forest. Groups of persons formed about each wagon, others shaking the hand of some sick friend or relative who would be left behind. The temporary camps covered with boards and some of bark that for 3 summer months had been the only shelter and home were now crackling and falling under a blazing flame. The day was bright and beautiful, but a gloomy thoughtfulness was strongly depicted in the lineaments of every face. In all the bustle of preparation, there was a silence and a stillness of the voice that betrayed the sadness of the heart.
The land that had been given to them by the Creator was no longer theirs. The people in whom they had entrusted, their government and the leadership had somehow or another turned against them. The ways in which we dealt with things no longer worked. The Cherokees had no immunity to this kind of moral and spiritual inequity. They didn't have an answer for it.
By land, it is over 800 miles to Indian Territory in the west, where they would start a new life with only the possessions they could bring with them. Most detachments took about 4 months. Some rode in wagons or on horses. Others walked the entire way. Rebecca Nugent was only 3 years old when she and her family were rounded up.
My father and mother walked all the way.
The people got so tired of eating salt pork on the journey that my father would walk through the woods as we traveled, hunting for turkeys and deer, which he brought into camp to feed us. There was much sickness among the immigrants, and a great many little children died of whooping cough.
The Baptist missionary Evan Jones, a loyal supporter of John Ross, accompanied his congregation to the Stockades and on the trek out west. He was one of only 3 white missionaries who actually walked the Trail of Tears with the Cherokees. His detachment of 1,250 left in October, and 3.5 months later arrived in northeast Oklahoma. En route, 71 died, and 5 babies were born.
It'll be a miracle of mercy if 1/4 escapes the exposure to that sickly climate at the most unfavorable season. 900 in one detachment and 700 in another were driven into the boats like culprits to the place of execution. They were exceedingly depressed, almost in the agonies of despair, in most of their faces, I fear, we shall not see again, until the great day when the oppressor and the oppressed shall appear before the tribunal of the righteous judge. I have no language to express the emotions which rend our hearts to witness the season of this cruel and unnecessary oppression.
If there was a choice, this was the choice. Do we stay and fight to the death, or do we go on a removal? That's not much of a choice.
Soon after dark, it commenced raining, and the wind drove the water into our carryall so that our bed and clothes became quite wet on one side. The weather also became very cold, and our blankets over the wagon were covered with snow when we arose.
Sudalich wilosans tagwalel. Hiski yakayal. Ega sowil. Ale jogetu agayal. Yang aniya weya. Ale aniga nake unanigi se naiya. Halaniga uniyo huse. Tade kayant. Igad dalado yagayal ande hum. Ase naka igad again tu niyo huse. Du ni stun ne dan so hyal ting ane jalek sinuna ne geto igadan unilu chahan kiluni yo huse hadih kayant iga unilosan na gen ina una ne gisa asen sawu gen iga losan stanna u godi losan stanna u godi
Cherokee were faced with hunger and starvation, and then put this in a context of a lot of deadly diseases that the Cherokees faced both during the Trail of Tears and on arrival in Indian Territory. It created a significant amount of population losses, both in terms of deaths, mortality, but also in terms of births that were people that weren't born. The fertility went down tremendously as well during those terrible circumstances during the Trail of Tears and immediately thereafter.
The events of 1838 and 39 and the removal of our people to Oklahoma, it would be a great disservice to history and to the memory of our people if we did not say that the suffering endured by those people did not result in a certain amount of hatred, but a hatred built of anger over the event, over that suffering. This is what is still a part of Cherokee culture. This is still a part of what we remember.
For those who survived the trail, arrival brought a whole host of challenges. Major and John Ridge and Elias Boudinot had high hopes for themselves in their new home. John and the Major had a mercantile establishment to manage. Boudinot and Worcester were going to embark on a translation of the New Testament into Cherokee, and they planned on establishing an Indian college. John Ridge was enthusiastic about the new land.
The country there is best adapted for agriculture and water privileges. It is superior to any country I ever saw in the U.S. It is populating very fast, and in a few years it will be the garden spot of the United States. Perfect friendship and contentedness prevail all over this land.
Surviving the trek out west was an ordeal. Surviving the struggle for power and unity in their new home was quite another. Almost immediately after arrival, serious friction developed between the various Cherokee parties contending for influence in their new land.
In the spring of 1839, when the last of the detachments of Cherokee had arrived in Oklahoma, it was a very, very difficult time for everyone. You had the old settlers who had begun removing as early as 1807, 1809. They had formed a government of their own. Then you had the first wave from the trail, which were the Treaty Party signers who signed, gathered their families, removed in comfort and with adequate money. And then you had this huge body of Cherokees, by far the majority, coming across on the trail. And they had passed a resolution before they left the East, which continued the government.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
So let's go on there. Don't henna to know where land. Treaty Party just done no saying home. I said let only one is again us can again. That's like how once can your own dale horse. Only new land no can head on glow histing. I need no hairska. Egon again. We know what this song. Just like a yearly. Now he on school. Raw started now, he got un leno he. Donna Hughes thing now. Treaty Party un jelly. Donny he hun un leno he na you. Ask a week on he go here needs a leg.
On June 22nd, 1839, a group of men surrounded the home of John Ridge at Honey Springs, pulling him from his bed over the screams of his wife and children, and proceeded to stab him to death. Major Ridge had been away from home, visiting some of his slaves in Arkansas. When he headed home that same day, a group of Cherokees ambushed him and shot him 5 times. Meanwhile, on that same fateful day, Elias Boudinot was working at his home in Park Hill. When 4 Cherokees approached him, they attacked him with knives and tomahawks, breaking his skull and mutilating his body. Upon hearing of the murders, Ross immediately sent out government representatives to investigate it. A messenger returned with a note from Mrs. Boudinot that Ross should flee for safety, as Treaty Party supporters of the slain men were raising a company of men to kill him. Ross's friends assembled more than 200 guards stationed around his home for protection. Though the Cherokee government did not sanction the actions, many Cherokees interpreted the killings as just on the Cherokee Nation's law, which said any citizen who ceded land without the government's consent would face the penalty of death.
My sense is that it would be inconsistent with John Ross's character and his public life for him to have been involved in this. He is somebody who could be very stubborn and very intransigent, but there is one thing that I think is pretty consistent throughout Ross's public career, and that is that when it comes to a moment when it appears that some event or another is going to cause deep and sharp divisions within the Cherokees, that's the line in the sand as far as Ross is concerned, and he doesn't cross that line. And I think he would certainly have realized that that's what these events would do.
I said, come. We know you, sir, we know to need dollar. Kadoka Yunda, take a henna hill, ne lado josco da de yesko. Kadoskin, ye the dog on a leske. Da jesle eager dehte on, so like a yesle.
John Ridge and Elias Boudinot, I think, were Cherokee patriots. I don't agree with the decisions that they made. I think they made very bad choices. They looked around them, they saw the kind of chaos that was taking place in the Cherokee Nation, and they felt it very keenly. I think that Boudinot was truly a man of principle. I think that he believed that the Cherokees were simply going to be annihilated. At the time, that looked to many Cherokees to be a real possibility. He saw himself and he saw his people as essentially between the devil and the deep blue sea.
I see the Ridge Party, the Ross Party, both as Cherokees who had the same goal. They wanted to see the Cherokee Nation survive. They wanted to see the Cherokee people flourish. There was no betrayal of that ideal, of those ideals on either part. There's no good guy, bad guy here, in my estimation.
Perhaps removal's most lasting legacy lies in memories, vivid memories of death and loss on the trail, memories that haunted even the white soldiers who carried out removal.
Murder is murder, and somebody must answer. Somebody must explain the streams of blood that flowed in the Indian country in the summer of 1838. Somebody must explain the 4,000 silent graves that mark the trail of the Cherokees to their exile.
People suffered beyond imagination. Morality suffered. Spirituality suffered. When the Cherokees finally arrived in Oklahoma, they arrived almost without any children and with few elders. So in a way, they arrived in Oklahoma with no past and no future.
Sisko, skiga, need to dance tesko. Kadoke ust ega deskon, jigan, snus tanidola. No, don't low hilla jano say hoy.
This was all of us. This was all of our land, and it was taken from us.
It was a story of people who did everything in their power to assert their rights as an Indian sovereign nation. And still, it came to nothing in the face of greed.
And I think it's an object lesson in the abuse of power.
The Trail of Tears is something that will forever burn in the memory of Cherokees and Americans. It's certainly something we don't ever want to have repeated, and it's something that we never want to forget.
A people survived unsurmountable odds and still remain on this earth today.
But the truly remarkable thing about this story is that there are Cherokees in eastern Oklahoma today, and there are Cherokees in western North Carolina today, and there are Cherokees throughout the United States and indeed throughout the world. That is, the Cherokees as a people survived. And this is not a tribute to the United States, it is a tribute to the Cherokee Nation.
I do know that the Cherokee spirit proved to be indomitable. I do know that they continued the traditions, continued ceremonies, continued stories, continued language, continued their identity as Cherokee people here in Oklahoma.
When you see the trials and tribulations of our ancestors, it creates an inspiration. If they could do what they did, what can we do today? We're people that face adversity, survive, adapt, prosper, and excel. It all comes back down to this simple proposition. It increases our quality of life. It makes us better human beings. It makes us happier. It makes us draw our children and our relations and our grandparents closer together and make every moment on this earth more valuable and worth living.